"I'm begging you, just do it quickly," said the employee, and the millionaire did the unthinkable. "Please, end this soon." Those were the words that Victoria Hayes spoke with tears in her eyes before the imposing desk of Chicago's most feared CEO. What James Crawford didn't know was that behind that desperate plea hid a story of love, sacrifice, and courage that would change both their lives forever. When fate tests two seemingly incompatible souls, who could imagine that a misunderstanding in a cold boardroom would unleash a passion capable of melting even the hardest heart? Victoria needed her severance pay urgently, but what she got was something no fortune could buy, a miracle that neither of them expected to find. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The sound of her worn heels echoed on the marble floor as Victoria Hayes headed toward the main conference room of Crawford Industries. With each step, she felt her heart pounding harder in her chest. Employees looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. Everyone knew what it meant to be summoned to the 45th floor on a Friday afternoon. No one survived a one-on-one meeting with James Crawford, the CEO known throughout Chicago as the Executor. And in his 3 years as company director, he had fired more executives than all his predecessors combined. Victoria stopped in front of the imposing oak doors. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling of her hands. At 28 years old, this job as an executive assistant was all she had. Everything that allowed her to care for Madison, her younger sister, whose leukemia treatment consumed every penny she earned. "Come in," ordered a deep voice from inside when she finally dared to knock. Upon entering, the first thing she noticed was the panoramic view of Chicago through the windows. The second was him, James Crawford, 35 years old, perfectly combed black hair, a custom-tailored suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. He stood by the window with his back to her, like a predator contemplating his territory. "Miss Hayes," he said, without turning around. "Please sit." Victoria obeyed, settling into the chair in front of the glass and steel desk. Instinctively, her fingers sought the small silver butterfly brooch she wore pinned to the lapel of her simple jacket. It had belonged to her mother, the only thing she kept from her after her death 10 years ago. "Do you know why you're here?" asked James, finally turning to face her. His grey eyes studied her with a coldness that made her shudder. He was a handsome man, in an almost painful way, with chiseled features that seemed carved in marble, but it was his gaze that everyone feared, calculating, impenetrable, relentless. "I imagine it has to do with the Richardson project," she responded, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. A perfectly arched eyebrow was the only reaction on James's face. "Very perceptive. Indeed, the Richardson project has been a disaster. We've lost $10 million, and our reputation is being questioned." Victoria pressed her lips together. She knew what was coming next. She had warned about inconsistencies in that project's numbers, had sent 3 detailed reports to her immediate supervisor, but Daniel Foster, the vice president of operations, had ignored her warnings. "Mr. Crawford, if you'll allow me to explain—" "I don't need explanations, Miss Hayes," he interrupted. "I need results. And the results say that the project your department supervised has failed spectacularly. But I sent several reports warning about—" "I didn't receive any report," he cut in, placing both hands on the desk and leaning slightly toward her. "What I have is a furious client, falling stock prices, and a board of directors demanding blood." Victoria felt a knot in her throat. It wasn't fair. She had done everything right, but Foster had evidently blocked her reports, now using her as a scapegoat. "I understand," she said, and suddenly a strange calm invaded her. It didn't matter anymore. In fact, this could be what she needed. "Am I going to be fired?" James seemed momentarily surprised by her direct question. He expected pleas, perhaps tears, not this resignation. "Your position will be eliminated, yes," he confirmed, studying her with renewed interest. "The entire department will be restructured." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. The severance pay, 3 months of full salary plus accumulated vacation. It would be enough to pay for the experimental treatment Madison so desperately needed. "I'm begging you," she whispered, her voice broken by sudden emotion. "Just do it quickly." Something changed in James's gaze, a flash of confusion, intrigue. "Excuse me?" "The dismissal," she clarified, looking him directly in the eyes. "I need the severance as soon as possible. Please do it quickly." For the first time in the entire conversation, James Crawford seemed genuinely baffled. No one in his entire career had begged him to speed up their dismissal. "Usually people beg to keep their jobs, not to lose them faster," he commented, walking around the desk to approach her. "Is there something I should know, Miss Hayes?" Victoria tensed at his proximity. From closer up she could notice details not visible from a distance, a small scar on his left eyebrow, the exact shade of grey in his eyes, like a storm about to unleash, the subtle scent of his expensive cologne. "It's personal," she responded, averting her gaze. "You just made it professional the moment you asked me to expedite a corporate process for reasons I don't know." His tone admitted no reply. It was the same one he used in board meetings to silence any opposition. Victoria understood there was no escape. "My sister is sick," she finally confessed. "Leukemia. There's an experimental treatment that could help her, but it's not covered by insurance and costs more than I could save in a year." As the words left her mouth, Victoria immediately regretted them. She didn't want anyone's compassion, much less from the man known for having no heart. However, what she saw in James's eyes wasn't compassion. It was something more complex, an emotion quickly suppressed that she couldn't identify. "I see," he said, returning to his position behind the desk, maintaining physical distance as if he needed to re-establish some kind of barrier between them. "How much time does your sister have?" The question, so direct and raw, caught her off guard. "Doctors say 6 months, maybe less." James nodded, typing something on his computer without looking at her. "You may leave, Miss Hayes. Human Resources will contact you on Monday." "Does that mean—" "It means you should return to your work and wait for instructions," he cut her off, his voice again cold and professional. "Have a good weekend." Victoria stood up, confused. She hadn't been explicitly fired, but she hadn't received any guarantees either. Not knowing what else to do, she headed for the door. "Miss Hayes," James called when she already had her hand on the doorknob. She turned, expectant. "Your loyalty to your family is admirable," he said, in a tone she couldn't interpret. "Not many people would put others above themselves." For an instant she seemed to see something in his eyes, a crack in the armor of the relentless CEO. But before she could decipher what it was, James returned his attention to his screen, effectively dismissing her. As she left the office, Victoria couldn't imagine that this encounter, far from being the end of her career at Crawford Industries, would be the beginning of something much deeper and transformative that would change their lives forever. The weekend passed in an agony of uncertainty. Victoria could barely concentrate on anything other than the impending call from Human Resources. She spent Saturday and Sunday with Madison at the hospital, feigning a calm she was far from feeling. Monday arrived with a constant drizzle that soaked Chicago. Victoria showed up at the office earlier than usual, expecting to find an email from Human Resources. Instead, she found a message from James Crawford's personal assistant, requesting her presence in the CEO's office at 9 o'clock sharp. When she entered the now familiar office, James wasn't alone. Daniel Foster, her direct boss, sat in front of the desk with an expression that mixed rage and fear. "Ah, Miss Hayes," James greeted, indicating she should sit next to Foster. "We've reached a resolution about the Richardson matter." Victoria nodded, mentally preparing herself for the worst. "I've personally reviewed all emails and documents related to the project," James continued, looking directly at Foster, whose face had acquired an ashen tone. "And I found something very interesting." With a fluid gesture, he turned his screen toward them. There, perfectly organized, were the 3 reports Victoria had sent, along with Foster's responses, systematically ignoring them. "Mr. Foster, According to these documents, Miss Hayes warned you on 3 separate occasions about inconsistencies in Richardson's financial reports. James's tone was deceptively soft, like the purr of a large cat before attacking. Can you explain to me why you decided to ignore these warnings? Foster began to stammer excuses, but James raised a hand, silencing him. I'm not interested in your justifications. What interests me is that you deliberately concealed critical information that could have prevented millions in losses for this company. His eyes hardened. You're fired, Mr. Foster. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Victoria watched, astonished, as her former boss was escorted out of the office, leaving her alone with James. As for you, Miss Hayes, he began, turning toward her. Am I also fired? She asked directly, needing clarity more than hope. To her surprise, James shook his head. On the contrary, I'm impressed by your diligence and professionalism, he said, leaning back in his chair. Few employees would dare question a superior's decisions, especially when that superior has a reputation for getting rid of those who contradict him. Victoria remained silent, processing what she had just heard. She wasn't fired. There would be no severance pay. Thank you, I suppose, she finally responded, unable to completely hide her disappointment. James studied her carefully, noticing the change in her demeanor. You seem disappointed to keep your job, he commented, and there was a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. It's not that, Victoria hesitated, but finally decided to be honest. It's just that I was counting on the severance for my sister's treatment, but I understand this is better, professionally speaking. A silence fell between them. James seemed to be considering something important. Your sister, he finally said. What kind of treatment does she need exactly? Victoria was surprised by the question. She didn't expect the feared CEO to remember, much less be interested in her personal situation. It's an experimental protocol at Northwestern Memorial, she explained, not understanding why she was taking the time to talk about this with him. It has good results, but since it's in the experimental phase, insurance doesn't cover it. James nodded, standing to look out the window, turning his back. I'll promote you to Foster's position, he suddenly announced without turning around. The salary increase should be enough to cover your sister's treatment, assuming, of course, that you can handle the responsibilities of the position. Victoria was left speechless. A direct promotion to vice presidency meant tripling her current salary. Mr. Crawford, I don't know what to say, she stammered. Why would you do that? James turned toward her, his expression inscrutable. Because the company needs people who aren't afraid to tell the truth, even when no one wants to hear it, he responded pragmatically. Besides, you've already shown better judgment than your predecessor. Consider it a purely business decision. But there was something in his gaze, a spark of something more than cold rationality. Thank you, Victoria said, feeling the words were insufficient. I won't let you down. I'm sure you won't, he responded, and for an instant it almost seemed he was going to smile. You'll start tomorrow. Today, take the day to familiarize yourself with your new responsibilities. When Victoria stood to leave, she noticed James's gaze briefly stopped at the butterfly brooch she wore. Nice brooch, he commented, in an almost casual tone that contrasted with his usual formality. Does it have any special meaning? Instinctively, Victoria touched the small silver butterfly. It belonged to my mother, she responded, surprised by the personal interest. She gave it to me before she died. Something passed through James's eyes, a fleeting emotion she couldn't interpret. Butterflies symbolized transformation, he said, and for a moment he seemed to be speaking more to himself than to her. Death and rebirth. Before Victoria could respond to that unexpectedly poetic comment, the phone rang, breaking the strange moment of connection. You may leave, Miss Hayes, James said, instantly returning to his professional tone while reaching for the phone. And congratulations on your promotion. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Victoria immersed herself in her new responsibilities as Vice President of Operations, determined to prove she deserved the position. The salary increase allowed Madison to begin the experimental treatment, and for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. What she didn't expect was the frequency with which she would find herself working directly with James Crawford. As vice president, she was now part of the executive team that met with him 3 times a week, and to her surprise, she discovered that the feared CEO genuinely valued her opinion. During a particularly tense meeting, Victoria dared to contradict the CFO who had been with the company for 20 years, pointing out inconsistencies in the financial projections. To her surprise, James not only listened attentively, but completely supported her assessment. After the meeting, James stopped her as everyone was leaving. "Good work in there," he said in a tone that could almost be interpreted as approving. Few have the courage to challenge Morrison on his own turf. "I just said what I saw," she responded, trying to downplay the matter. "Precisely," James looked at her intently. "That honesty is refreshing." There was a moment of silence between them, one of those strange instants where time seemed to stop. Victoria noticed that James never maintained prolonged eye contact with anyone except with her. "How is your sister?" he suddenly asked, breaking the moment. The question caught her by surprise. It was the 3rd time in 2 weeks he had asked about Madison, showing an interest that seemed genuine. "She's responding well to treatment," she responded, an involuntary smile lighting up her face. "Doctors are optimistic," James nodded, and for an instant Victoria thought she saw a shadow of a smile on his lips. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, and he sounded sincere. "If you need flexible hours to accompany her, let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." "James," he corrected, and this time he did smile, barely a movement of lips, but enough to completely transform his face. "I think at this point we can use our first names, Victoria." The rumors didn't take long to begin. Victoria heard them in the hallways, in the cafeteria, even in the bathrooms. Comments about how she had gone from assistant to vice president in one day, insinuations about special favors, suspicious looks when she entered James's office. One afternoon, while working late on a new project, she received a message from James asking her to come up to his office. Upon arriving, she found him contemplating the illuminated city, his silhouette outlined against the lights of Chicago. "Please close the door," he requested without turning around. Victoria obeyed, noticing the office was in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the city light entering through the windows. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, staying close to the door. James turned slowly. In the dim light, his features seemed less severe, almost vulnerable. "I've heard the rumors," he said directly. "About us." Victoria felt heat rising to her cheeks, grateful for the partial darkness that hid it. "They're just office gossip," she responded, trying to sound indifferent. "People always talk." "They're hurting you professionally," he continued, approaching. "Your promotion was on merit, but those rumors are tarnishing it. Maybe we should distance ourselves publicly." There was something in his voice, a note of reluctance that didn't fit with his proposal. "Is that what you want?" Victoria asked, surprising herself with her boldness. James stopped a meter from her, so close she could see the exact moment his pupils dilated slightly. "What I want and what's right don't always coincide," he responded enigmatically. "I don't understand." "I'm your boss, Victoria," he said, deliberately using her first name for the first time. "Any personal interaction between us would be inappropriate." Victoria felt her heart accelerate. Was he admitting he felt something for her? "Are you suggesting there's a personal interaction between us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James took another step toward her, entering her personal space. Up close, Victoria could see the internal battle reflected in his eyes. "I'm suggesting there could be," he responded with careful precision, "and that it would be complicated." The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Victoria had never felt such tension, as if every oxygen molecule vibrated with unspoken possibilities. "Why did you really promote me?" she suddenly asked, needing clarity. "Was it really because of my work, or was there something more?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, For an instant, his perfect mask of control cracked, revealing something raw and honest underneath. "I promoted you because you deserved it," he responded with intensity. "Because you're brilliant, insightful, and brave. Because this company needs people like you." He paused, his gaze even more intense. "The fact that I can't stop thinking about you is a personal inconvenience I must deal with." Victoria held her breath. She never would have expected such a confession from the always controlled James Crawford. "James, But before she could respond, the office door burst open. Rachel, James's personal assistant, entered hastily. "Mr. Crawford, excuse the interruption, but Mr. Tanaka is on the phone from Tokyo. He says it's urgent." The mask instantly fell back into place. James straightened, stepping back. "Thank you, Rachel," he said in his usual professional tone. "We'll continue this conversation at another time, Miss Hayes." The return to the last name and formal treatment was like a bucket of cold water. Victoria nodded, understanding the signal. "Of course, Mr. Crawford, with your permission." As she left the office, she felt she was leaving something important behind, a moment of honesty that might never repeat itself. The call came past midnight. Victoria was by Madison's hospital bed, who was finally sleeping after a difficult day of treatment. James's name flashing on her phone screen surprised her so much she almost dropped the device. "James," she answered quietly, stepping into the hallway so as not to wake her sister. "Victoria," his voice sounded different, almost vulnerable. "I'm sorry to call at this hour. Are you at the hospital?" "Yes, but don't worry. Madison is asleep." She paused. "Is something wrong?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I need to talk to you," he finally said. "It's personal. I understand if it's not a good time." Victoria had never heard that tone in him. He sounded almost human. "I can talk now," she responded, intrigued. "The nurse is here and Madison will sleep all night with the medication." "Could I send a car for you?" he asked, and before she could respond added, "It's not my intention to be inappropriate. It's just that there's something I need to show you, something that can't wait until tomorrow." 20 minutes later, an elegant black car picked her up in front of the hospital. To her surprise, the vehicle didn't head to the Crawford Industries offices, but took the bridge toward the suburbs. The car finally stopped in front of an old red brick building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. James waited for her at the entrance, dressed casually in jeans and a black sweater, so different from his impeccable suits that for a moment Victoria almost didn't recognize him. "Thank you for coming," he said, and there was a tension in his voice she had never perceived before. "I know it's strange, but after our conversation in the office, I felt you needed to know this. You needed to understand." He led her inside the building, going up to the 3rd floor. James opened the door to a small but impeccable apartment. The walls were covered with photographs, and there were fresh flowers on a table by the window. An older woman stood up when she saw them enter. She had the same eye color as James, but her face showed a warmth he rarely exhibited. "James, you didn't tell me you were bringing company," the woman said, looking curiously at Victoria. "It was a last-minute decision, Mom," James responded, and the affection in his voice was evident. "This is Victoria Hayes. She works with me." Victoria tried to hide her confusion. His mother? According to all the articles she had read about him, James Crawford had been an orphan since he was 16. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Crawford," Victoria greeted, extending her hand. The woman smiled warmly. "Oh, call me Catherine, dear. All of James's friends do, though he brings so few." But she turned to her son. "Will she stay for dinner?" "No, Mom. I just came to show her something. How are you feeling today?" "Oh, fine, fine. Dr. Williams came this morning. He says everything is stable." She made a casual gesture. "You two talk comfortably. I'll go to bed." Catherine said goodbye with a kiss on James's cheek and a smile for Victoria, leaving them alone in the small living room. "I don't understand," Victoria said when the woman disappeared behind a door. "Your parents were supposed to have died in an accident when you were a teenager." James looked at her with an intensity that made her shudder. "That's the official story, yes," he confirmed. indicating she should sit. "The truth is more complicated." He sat across from her, his eyes fixed on a photograph of a smiling man hugging a much younger Catherine. "My father died when I was 15, he began, his voice controlled, but with an underlying pain that was impossible not to notice. "Cancer. My mother never fully recovered. She began having episodes of disorientation, forgetfulness, strange behaviors." He paused, as if gathering strength to continue. "When I turned 18, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. By then she had already spent almost all of my father's inheritance on treatments. I had to drop out of college to take care of her." Victoria looked at him, astonished. None of this appeared in the official biography of the ruthless CEO. "Why keep it secret?" she asked softly. James sketched a bitter smile. "The business world doesn't forgive weakness, Victoria," he responded. "When I finally got my first important job in finance, I decided to create a new narrative. The self-made orphan sells better than the son of a woman with mental illness who might have inherited her condition." The pragmatic cruelty of his reasoning shocked her. "But you still take care of her," Victoria pointed out. "All these years." James nodded, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw true emotion in his eyes. "She's my mother," he said simply. "I hired nurses, got the best specialists. Sometimes she has good months, like now. Other times," his voice faded, "other times she doesn't even recognize me." Victoria felt a lump in her throat. Suddenly many things began to make sense. His obsession with control, his emotional coldness, his apparent inability to trust others. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked gently. James looked directly at her, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed anyone to see. "Because you understand what it is to sacrifice for your family," he responded. "Because when I saw you with that brooch, talking about your mother, when you mentioned your sister, I saw something in you I recognized, something I thought no one else could understand." He stood up, approaching the window. "The night you came to my office, willing to accept being fired to get money for your sister, I saw myself 20 years ago, doing whatever was necessary to save someone I loved." Victoria approached him, moved by his confession. "James, I'm not finished," he gently interrupted. "There's something else you should know." He took a deep breath, as if preparing for something difficult. "The reason I reacted that way when you mentioned the experimental treatment for Madison is because I know that protocol," he confessed. "In fact, I helped finance it." Victoria looked at him, confused. "What?" "My mother was part of the early trials of a similar treatment years ago for the psychotic episodes associated with her condition," he explained. "It worked temporarily. Since then, I've donated annually to research and experimental therapies, including the protocol they're using with your sister." Victoria was left speechless. The man in front of her was so different from the James Crawford the world knew that he almost seemed like another person. "Why keep even your donations secret?" she finally asked. "People would see you differently if they knew this." "I don't want them to see me differently," he responded with surprising frankness. "I don't want their pity, nor for them to question my business decisions because they think I'm unstable or too emotional. What I do for my mother, what I donate to medical research, it's personal, like what you do for your sister." Victoria then understood she was witnessing something extraordinary. James Crawford, the man who never showed weakness, was offering her his most vulnerable truth. He was allowing her to see beyond the mask he showed the world. Without thinking, she extended her hand and took his. James tensed for an instant, clearly unaccustomed to physical contact, but didn't pull away. "Thank you," she said simply, "for trusting me with this." James looked at their joined hands, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "For years," he said quietly, "I've kept everyone at a distance. It's safer that way, easier, but with you—" He interrupted himself, clearly struggling with words he wasn't used to expressing. "With you it's different," he finally concluded, "and that terrifies me." Victoria felt her heart accelerate. They were in dangerous territory, crossing lines they shouldn't cross. He was still her boss. She was still his subordinate. But in that moment, In that small apartment in the suburbs, so far from the corporate offices and hierarchies, they were simply two people connecting at a level neither had expected. "It scares me too," she admitted, "but I'm here." Hey! The following morning, Victoria arrived at the office with her mind still processing the events of the previous night. She had returned to the hospital shortly after midnight, after a silent trip, during which both she and James seemed absorbed in their own thoughts. They had said goodbye with a simple good night, though the unspoken words between them weighed more than any conversation. What she didn't expect was the chaos she would find upon arriving at Crawford Industries. The hallways buzzed with rumors and nervous glances. Rachel, James's assistant, intercepted her as soon as she got off the elevator. "Victoria, thank God you're here," the normally composed woman exclaimed. "It's total madness. The board of directors has been meeting since 7 in the morning. What happened?" she asked, feeling an inexplicable knot in her stomach. Rachel looked around, making sure no one could hear them. "A report in the Financial Times," she whispered. "Someone leaked internal information about the company's accounting practices. They're suggesting irregularities in the last 3 years. Stock has fallen 15% at market opening." Victoria felt the ground sway beneath her feet. As Vice President of Operations, this fell directly within her area of responsibility. "Where's James?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "In the boardroom, with the directors and lawyers," Rachel responded. "I haven't seen him like this since." "Well, I've never seen him like this." Victoria nodded, heading immediately toward the boardroom. She needed to understand what was happening and how she could help. As she approached, she could hear raised voices through the closed doors. James's voice, normally controlled, sounded sharp and harsh. When she finally entered, all eyes turned to her. James stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury. Thomas Mitchell, the CFO, looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. "Miss Hayes," James greeted, his tone completely professional, as if the previous night had never happened. "How timely. We were discussing who could be behind this situation." Victoria noticed a strange tone in his voice, almost like a veiled accusation. "I just found out," she responded, standing firm. "What can I do to help?" Richard Bennett, the oldest member of the board of directors, cleared his throat. "Perhaps Miss Hayes can shed some light on this," he said, sliding a copy of the Financial Times toward her. "After all, the leaked information comes mainly from the operations department, the same department she now heads." Victoria felt all eyes fixed on her as she took the newspaper. The report detailed supposed questionable accounting practices, citing internal documents that could only have been provided by someone with high-level access. "This is absurd," she said, looking up. "I had no knowledge of these supposed irregularities, and I certainly didn't leak any information." "Interesting," Bennett commented coldly, "considering you were the one who pointed out problems in the Richardson project just before being promoted. It could almost be interpreted that you knew exactly where to look." The insinuation was so transparent that Victoria felt her breath catch. They were suggesting she had leaked information to ensure Foster's failure and obtain his position. "That's completely false," she responded, maintaining composure with difficulty. "My reports on Richardson are documented and were sent through official channels." "And yet, here we are," Thomas Mitchell intervened, "with information that only someone from your department could have provided." Victoria looked at James, hoping for some kind of support, some signal from the man who, the night before, had opened his heart to her. Instead, she found a cold, impenetrable gaze. The emotionless CEO was back, the ruthless executor. "I believe," James said after a long silence, "that we should consider all possibilities, including that Miss Hayes acted with a personal agenda." The words hit her like a physical slap. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could he even suggest that after everything they had shared? "A personal agenda?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "You mean helping my sick sister? That's my personal agenda?" The room fell silent. She had used informal address in front of the entire board, revealing a familiarity that would only fuel the rumors. James looked at her directly, without blinking. "I mean that we all have motivations that can cloud our professional judgment," he responded coldly. "Even the best intentions can lead to questionable decisions." Victoria felt something break inside her. The night before, she had seen the man behind the mask, had trusted him, had believed they had connected on a deep level. And now, at the first sign of trouble, he was throwing her to the wolves. "I understand," she said, picking up the newspaper and straightening up. "In that case, I assume my presence at this meeting isn't necessary, given that I'm apparently a suspect." She turned to leave, but James's voice stopped her. "Actually, Miss Hayes, your presence is required," he said, his tone completely professional. "As Vice President of Operations, we need your full cooperation in the internal investigation that will begin immediately. Meanwhile, you'll be suspended from your duties with pay until this situation is clarified." Victoria turned slowly, facing him with a dignity she didn't know she possessed. "Of course, Mr. Crawford," she responded, emphasizing his last name. "You have my full cooperation, though perhaps you should look for the leaker closer to your inner circle of trust." Their eyes met in a silent duel. For an instant, Victoria thought she saw a flash of regret in James's gaze, but it disappeared so quickly she could have imagined it. "The investigation will be thorough and fair," he assured. "No one is above suspicion." Victoria nodded dryly, maintaining composure as she left the room. It was only when she reached her office, closing the door behind her, that she allowed the emotions to overwhelm her. Betrayal, pain, confusion, everything mixed in a whirlwind that threatened to drown her. How could she have been so naive? How could she think that James Crawford, the man known for his ruthless efficiency, would put his personal feelings above the company? As she began to collect her personal belongings, the door opened without warning. James entered, closing it behind him and making sure the blinds were down. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly. "Come to personally escort me out." "Victoria, listen to me," he said quietly, approaching. "It's not what it seems." "Isn't it? Because it seemed pretty clear to me that you just suggested I'm a traitor in front of the entire board," she responded, unable to contain her bitterness. "After last night, after everything you shared with me, how could you?" James looked toward the door, as if verifying no one could hear them. "I had to do it," he responded urgently. "I know it wasn't you who leaked that information, but I had to seem like I suspected you." Victoria looked at him, confused and still hurt. "What are you talking about?" "The leak came from someone on the board of directors," he explained quietly. "Someone who wants to destabilize the company. If I openly showed I supported you, that I trusted you, they would have known we're connected." He stopped, as if he didn't have the exact word to define what was between them. "So you humiliate me publicly to protect your image," she concluded, still hurt. "To protect you," he corrected, approaching closer. "If they know how important you've become to me, they'll make you a target. They'll destroy you to get to me." Victoria looked at him, trying to process his words, how important she had become to him. "James, you can't play with people like this," she finally said. "You can't show me your true self one night and treat me like a criminal the next day. It's not fair." "Nothing in my life has been fair, Victoria," he responded, with an intensity that surprised her. "I've built walls around myself for so long that I don't know how to let them down without everything collapsing." He took another step toward her, entering completely into her personal space. "Last night was real," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "What I showed you, what I told you. I've never been so honest with anyone." Victoria wanted to believe him. Part of her longed to trust him, in this vulnerable and human version that only she had seen. But the wound of his public betrayal was still too fresh. "I need time," she finally said. "This is too much." James nodded slowly, a flash of resignation in his gaze. "I understand," he responded, stepping back. "But I need you to know that I'm going to find whoever's behind this. And when I do, everyone will know I never doubted you." The following days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Victoria spent most of her time at the hospital with Madison, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Her sister, always perceptive despite her illness, noticed something had changed. "You're different," Madison commented one afternoon while they watched television in her hospital room. "Quieter, and that wrinkle between your eyebrows appears when you're worried." Victoria tried to smile, unconsciously running her fingers over her forehead. "I'm just tired," she lied. "Work has been stressful." "Liar," Madison responded with a weak smile. "You haven't even been to work in 3 days. The nurses talk, you know. They say your company is in all the newspapers." Victoria sighed. She should have known she couldn't fool her sister. "It's complicated," she admitted. "There are some problems at the company, yes, but they'll be resolved." Madison observed her with those dark eyes so similar to hers, but which seemed to possess a wisdom that went beyond her 19 years. "Is it because of him?" she suddenly asked. "The man who's paying for my treatment?" Victoria almost spilled the coffee she was holding. What are you talking about?" Madison rolled her eyes, a gesture so teenage and normal that for a moment it made Victoria forget the gravity of her illness. "Please, Vic, I'm not stupid," she said. "I know someone is paying for this experimental treatment. Our insurance would never cover it, and your salary, even with the promotion, wouldn't be enough." Victoria was left speechless. She had underestimated her sister. "How did you know?" "Dr. Anderson mentioned something about the benefactor," Madison responded. "And then I saw you talking to a man in the hallway a few days ago. Tall, expensive suit, intense gaze. He seemed important." Victoria remembered the moment. James had come to the hospital to inform her about progress in the internal investigation. He had been discreet, professional, maintaining the physical distance both knew was necessary in public. But his eyes had said much more. "He's my boss," she finally explained. "James Crawford." "The famous executor?" Madison seemed impressed. "Wow, he doesn't seem so scary in person." "You don't know him," Victoria murmured. "But you do," Madison responded, studying her face. "And there's something more there, isn't there?" Victoria lowered her gaze, unable to lie, but equally unable to explain the complex relationship she had developed with James. "It's complicated," she repeated. "The best things always are," Madison said with a knowing smile. "You know, the days he comes to see you, you have a different sparkle in your eyes. Even now, just talking about him, your face changes." Victoria felt herself blushing. Was it that obvious? "You're imagining things," she weakly defended herself. "Maybe," Madison conceded, "but if there's something this illness has taught me, it's not to waste time denying what you feel. Life's too short for that, Vic." Her phone vibrated with a message. It was James. "We need to talk. Important progress in the investigation. Can I see you tonight?" Victoria hesitated. Part of her longed to see him, to understand what was happening. Another part feared that each encounter only complicated things between them more. "Okay, I'll be at the hospital until 9. The response was immediate. "I'll pick you up. There's a place where we can talk privately." When the clock struck 9, Victoria descended the hospital steps with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The familiar black car waited at the entrance, but to her surprise, it was James himself who got out to receive her, not his driver. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said as he opened the passenger door for her. Victoria immediately noticed something was different. James seemed tense, almost nervous, an emotion she rarely associated with him. "What happened?" she asked directly once both were in the vehicle. James started the engine, merging into Chicago's night traffic. "We found the leaker," he responded, his voice controlled but with a hint of satisfaction. "It was Bennett. He's been selling confidential information to our competitors for months." Victoria processed the news. Richard Bennett, the oldest member of the board of directors, the same one who had insinuated her guilt. "Why?" she finally asked. "He has more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes." James smiled without humor. "It wasn't about money," he explained. "It was about revenge. When I took control of the company 3 years ago, I rejected his merger proposal with Westbrook Industries. It was a bad deal for us, but his son is vice president there. He took it personally. Victoria felt a knot in her stomach, remembering the public humiliation she had suffered. So he used me as a scapegoat, she said, and you played along. James glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. I had to, he responded, in a tone that suggested he had gone over this conversation many times in his mind. If I had shown favoritism toward you, it would have confirmed his suspicions that there was something between us. It would have put you in an even more vulnerable position. I still don't understand why it was necessary to humiliate me publicly, she insisted, the pain still fresh. James remained silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. Because Bennett wasn't just leaking information about the company, he finally said. He was also spreading rumors about you, about us. Victoria tensed. What kind of rumors? The kind that could destroy your professional reputation forever, he responded, his voice hardening. Insinuations that you got your promotion through inappropriate means. Victoria felt heat rising to her cheeks, part embarrassment, part indignation. And you thought the best way to counter those rumors was to treat me like a suspect, she concluded, her voice tinged with bitterness. The car stopped at a lookout point, offering a panoramic view of Chicago. James turned off the engine, turning completely toward her. I thought the best way to protect you was to create public distance between us, he corrected, so that when we found the real culprit, no one could say you received preferential treatment. Victoria held his gaze, defiant. I don't need you to protect me, James. I need you to trust me, to be honest with me, especially after everything you shared that night. James let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair in an unusually vulnerable gesture. Honesty isn't something I'm familiar with, he admitted. I've spent so much time building this public persona, this version of myself that's untouchable, that sometimes I forget how to be just me. There was raw sincerity in his voice that disarmed part of Victoria's defense. The night I took you to meet my mother, he continued, it was the first time in years I've shown that part of my life to anyone. No one in the company knows about her, about my real past. No one except you. Their eyes met in the penumbra of the car, and Victoria saw in them a vulnerability that contradicted everything the world believed it knew about James Crawford. And now what? She asked, her voice softer. Bennett has been exposed. My name is clear. Do we go back to normal? Pretend none of this happened? James slowly shook his head. I don't think we can go back, he responded, his voice barely a whisper. Not after everything that's happened between us. The atmosphere inside the car changed, charging with a different, more electric tension. Victoria was painfully aware of James's proximity, the confined space they shared, the intensity of his gaze. What do you want, James? She asked directly, tired of half-truths and contradictory messages. From me? From us? James extended his hand, gently brushing her cheek with his fingers, a touch so light she could have almost imagined it. I want what I've never allowed myself to want, he confessed, his voice hoarse with an emotion he rarely showed. Someone who sees me as I really am. Someone who understands what it is to sacrifice everything for family. Someone like you, Victoria. Victoria's heart beat so hard, she was sure he could hear it. She had dreamed of this moment, feared it, anticipated it without admitting it even to herself. James, But before she could finish, Victoria's phone rang loudly, breaking the spell of the moment. It was the hospital. Yes, she answered, a premonition of dread settling in her stomach. Yes, this is Victoria Hayes. What? No, I'm close. I'll be there in 10 minutes. When she hung up, her face had lost all color. It's Madison, she said, her voice trembling. She's had a relapse. I need to get back to the hospital now. Without saying a word, James started the engine and drove at full speed back to the medical center. As the city lights blurred through the window, Victoria felt his hand finding hers, offering silent support that meant more than any words. The next 3 days were a blur of anguish and waiting. Madison had developed an infection that seriously compromised the experimental treatment. Doctors fought to stabilize her while Victoria maintained a constant vigil by her bed. To her surprise, James was present every day, not intrusively, but as a constant and comforting presence. Sometimes he sat in silence next to her in the waiting room. Other times, he took care of bringing her food or coffee. On one occasion, she found him talking quietly with the doctors, his expression intense and determined. "What were you telling them?" she asked, when he returned to her side. "That they have at their disposal any resources they need," he responded simply. "Specialists, equipment, whatever. Money isn't a problem." Victoria nodded, too emotionally exhausted to argue or question his generosity. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was Madison. On the fourth day, there was finally good news. The infection was beginning to subside, and Madison's vital signs were gradually improving. "The worst is over," Dr. Anderson announced with a tired smile. "Your sister is a fighter, Victoria." For the first time in days, Victoria allowed hope to bloom in her chest. When she left Madison's room after seeing her awake and slightly more animated, she found James waiting in the hallway, his usually impeccable suit replaced by jeans and a t-shirt, a sign he had come straight from home. "She's improving," Victoria said before he could ask. "Dr. Anderson says the worst has passed." The relief that crossed James's face was genuine and disarming. "That's excellent news," he responded, and for a moment it seemed he wanted to hug her, though he restrained himself. "Have you eaten anything?" Victoria shook her head. She had barely touched food in days. "You should eat something," he insisted gently. "There's a decent cafe across the street. Just half an hour. Madison will be fine, and you need to keep your strength up." Too exhausted to argue, Victoria agreed. The cafe was small and quiet, a refuge from the hospital bustle. Sitting at a secluded table with steaming cups of coffee and barely touched sandwiches in front of them, they finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. "I owe you an apology," James began, breaking the silence, "for how I handled the situation with Bennett. I should have explained my strategy to you from the beginning." Victoria looked at him, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, a sign he hadn't slept much lately either. "Yes, you should have," she agreed, but without the bitterness she would have felt days earlier. "Though I understand why you didn't. Trust doesn't come naturally to you." James nodded, accepting the observation without defensiveness. "My entire adult life has been about protecting my mother, the company, my privacy," he explained. "Control and distance became my defense mechanisms. And then you appeared, and suddenly those walls I had so carefully built began to crumble." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I got scared," he finally admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him physical effort. "When Bennett started spreading those rumors about us, I saw how it could affect you, how my closeness could hurt you professionally, so I did the only thing I know how to do when I feel threatened. I retreated, raised the walls again." Victoria had never heard James speak so frankly about his emotions. It was as if Madison's crisis had torn down the last barriers between them, and now Bennett has been exposed, she said. "What happens with us?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities. "That night in the car," James began, his voice softer, "before the hospital called, I was about to tell you something." Victoria nodded, remembering the moment perfectly, the interrupted confession. "I'm listening now," she said simply. James looked at her directly, without masks, without pretenses. "I've never been good at expressing what I feel," he confessed. "But these days, watching you with your sister, seeing your strength, your unwavering loyalty, have made me realize I can't deny it anymore." He took a deep breath, as if preparing. "I love you, Victoria," he said with a simplicity that contrasted with the magnitude of the confession. "Probably from the moment I saw you defend your team against Foster, long before our meeting in my office. And it terrifies me, because I've never loved anyone like this, and I have no idea how to do it right." Victoria felt time stop. Of all the things she had expected to hear, this direct and vulnerable confession left her speechless. The powerful CEO, the man known for his emotional coldness, sat before her with his heart completely exposed. "James, But before she could respond, the cafe door burst open. Thomas Mitchell, the CFO, entered hastily, immediately locating them. "James, I finally found you," he exclaimed, approaching their table. "I've been calling you for hours." "My phone is on silent," James responded, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate the interruption. "I'm in the middle of an important conversation, Thomas." Mitchell looked briefly at Victoria before turning back to James. "It's Catherine," he said quietly. "Rachel received a call. She's having one of her episodes. They've taken her to Northwestern." James's face lost all color. Victoria had never seen him like this. Completely vulnerable, naked fear in his eyes. "When?" he asked, standing immediately. "An hour ago," Mitchell responded. "I sent my personal driver. He's waiting downstairs to take you." James nodded, but seemed momentarily lost, as if he didn't know what to do next. Victoria stood too, making an instant decision. "I'll go with you," she said firmly. James looked at her, surprise and gratitude mixing in his expression. "But Madison is stable," Victoria responded, "and you've supported me these days without fail. Let me do the same for you." For a moment it seemed he would protest, but finally nodded. Victoria saw in that simple gesture something few people had witnessed. James Crawford accepting help, allowing himself to be vulnerable before someone else. A week after Catherine's episode, things seemed to be slowly returning to normal. James's mother had been stabilized and transferred back to her apartment in the suburbs. Victoria had returned to her position at Crawford Industries, completely exonerated of any suspicion, thanks to evidence proving Bennett's guilt. The day began like any other, with executive meetings and conference calls. Victoria had quickly fallen back into her routine, though things between her and James had changed subtly. In the office they maintained impeccable professionalism, but there were shared glances, small gestures that spoke of an intimacy that transcended their working relationship. James's confession in the cafe had remained unanswered due to the crisis with Catherine, and both seemed to be in a kind of emotional limbo, aware of the feelings that existed between them, but without having defined exactly how to proceed. That afternoon, Victoria was reviewing some contracts when Rachel appeared at her office door, her expression alarmingly serious. "Victoria, Mr. Crawford requests your immediate presence in his office," she said, in a tone that suggested urgency. "Has something happened?" Victoria asked, immediately worried. "I'm not authorized to discuss it," Rachel responded, which only increased her concern. When she entered James's office, she found him standing by the window in the same position she had seen him that first day. But his posture was different, tense, as if he were containing an internal storm. "James," she called softly, closing the door behind her. "What's happening?" He turned slowly, and what Victoria saw on his face alarmed her. His eyes, normally controlled, showed a mixture of anger, worry, and something that seemed almost fear. "Please sit down," he said, indicating the chairs in front of his desk. Victoria obeyed, each second increasing her apprehension. "I just received a call," James began, his voice carefully controlled, "from Dr. Sharma, Madison's oncologist." Victoria felt the world stop. Why would her sister's doctor call James instead of her? "What? Why? Has something happened to Madison?" The questions came rushing out. "No, it's not that." James raised a hand to calm her. "Madison is fine. But doctor, Sharma informed me that the hospital has received a court order to suspend her treatment." Victoria looked at him, confused. "A court order? I don't understand." James sat across from her, leaning slightly forward. "Someone has filed a lawsuit claiming that the experimental treatment Madison is receiving hasn't followed proper approval protocols," he explained, each word measured. "They're demanding it be suspended immediately until a full investigation is conducted." A panic began to form in Victoria's chest. Without that treatment, Madison's chances would drastically decrease. "But that's absurd," she protested. "The protocol has all the necessary approvals. You yourself helped finance it. You told me. James nodded gravely. Exactly. And that's what makes this particularly suspicious. He stood up, walking around the desk to sit in the chair next to her. Victoria, this isn't a coincidence. It's a direct attack, and I think I know who's behind it. Who? Bennett, he responded, his expression hardening. This is his final revenge. He couldn't destroy the company, so now he's trying to destroy me. Through you. Victoria felt her blood freeze. Would Bennett be capable of endangering a young, sick woman's life just for revenge? What can we do? She asked, fighting to maintain composure. Madison can't interrupt treatment, James. She won't survive. I know, he responded, and there was iron determination in his voice. And we're not going to allow it. He stood up, returning to his position behind the desk, adopting the posture of the ruthless CEO Victoria had seen so many times. I've called the entire legal department, he continued. They're working to file an emergency appeal. I've also personally contacted the judge who issued the order. We have a hearing tomorrow at 9. Victoria nodded, grateful for his efficiency, but still terrified by what this meant for her sister. And if it doesn't work, she asked, voicing her greatest fear, what if the judge maintains the suspension? James looked at her intently, and in his eyes she saw a determination she had never witnessed before. There's another option, he said slowly, one I've been considering as a last resort. He stood up, heading to a small safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. He opened it quickly and took out a folder he placed on the desk. This is the complete treatment protocol, he explained. It includes the exact formulation, doses, the complete regimen, everything necessary to continue administering it, even without the hospital's official approval. Victoria looked at him astonished. James, that would be illegal. It would be, he confirmed without looking away, and it could destroy my career, possibly even send me to prison. But it would save Madison's life. The magnitude of what he was offering left Victoria speechless. This man, who had built his empire on control and meticulous calculation, was willing to risk everything, his reputation, his freedom, his future, for her sister, for her. I can't ask you to do that, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. You're not asking me, he responded with surprising gentleness. I'm offering it to you, Victoria, and I would do it without hesitation if it were necessary. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the doubts Victoria had harbored about James's feelings dissipated. No man would risk everything he had built for someone he didn't love deeply. Why? She asked, though she already knew the answer. James extended his hand, taking hers with a tenderness that contrasted with his usual reserve. Because I love you, he responded simply. And loving someone means being willing to sacrifice everything for their happiness. Victoria felt the tears she'd been holding finally spill over. Without thinking, she stood up and walked around the desk, throwing herself into his arms. James received her, embracing her with a strength that spoke of protection, commitment, unconditional love. I love you too, she whispered against his chest. The words she had kept for weeks finally released. And I'm so scared, James. So scared of losing her, of losing you, of losing everything. He held her closer, as if he wanted to absorb her pain, take it away. You're not going to lose anything, he promised, his voice a mixture of tenderness and determination. We're going to fight, together, and we'll win, Victoria. I promise you that. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, so she could see the truth in his. When you asked me to do it quickly that day in my office, she said, remembering their first meeting, I never imagined it would end like this. That I would find someone willing to sacrifice everything for me, for my sister. James smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face, making him look younger, freer. And I never imagined that stubborn assistant begging me to fire her quickly would become the most important person in my life, he responded, gently moving a strand of hair from her face. Life has strange ways of giving us exactly what we need, even when we think we know what we want. Victoria nodded, perfectly understanding what he meant. She had entered that office thinking what she needed was money to save her sister, And while that was still true, she had found something equally valuable, a love that made her stronger, braver, more complete. "We're going to win this battle, James," she said with renewed determination. "For Madison, for us." He nodded, his eyes shining with a silent promise. "For us," he repeated, sealing the words with a kiss that spoke of commitment, of future, of a love that had been born in the most improbable circumstances but had been forged in shared truth and vulnerability. And as the afternoon fell over Chicago, enveloping the city in golden shadows, Victoria knew with certainty that no matter what the future held for them, she would no longer face her battles alone. She had by her side a man who had done the unthinkable, tear down his own walls, show himself vulnerable, risk everything for love. A man who, when she had begged him, "Just do it quickly," had chosen instead to take the time to know her, to understand her, to love her. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. The courtroom was silent as Judge Simmons reviewed the documents presented by both parties. Victoria, seated in the front row next to James, felt each second stretch painfully as they waited for the verdict that would determine Madison's future. The hearing had been intense. The lawyer hired by Bennett, because James had been right, everything had been orchestrated by him, had presented seemingly solid arguments about supposed irregularities in the experimental protocol's approval. However, James's legal team had counterattacked with impeccable preparation, dismantling each allegation with documented evidence and expert testimony. Now, as the judge deliberated, Victoria couldn't help but think about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. James had worked tirelessly, mobilizing all his resources, calling every contact he had, even having his team spend the night preparing the defense. And despite all that effort, he had also found time to be with her, to hold her hand when fear threatened to overwhelm her, to remind her she wasn't alone. "It'll be okay," James whispered, as if he had read her thoughts, gently squeezing her hand. "Judge Simmons is known for his impartiality. He'll see through this farce." Victoria nodded, wanting to believe him. She had to believe him. Finally, the judge looked up from the documents and adjusted his glasses. "Having carefully reviewed all the evidence presented," he began, his voice echoing in the silent room, "I find that the request to maintain the treatment suspension lacks sufficient legal and factual basis." Victoria felt her heart flip, but she restrained herself from reacting until she heard the complete verdict. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I order the immediate lifting of the suspension and allow patient Madison Hayes to continue receiving treatment without interruptions." A sob of relief escaped Victoria's throat. They had won. Madison could continue her treatment. "Furthermore," the judge added, his tone hardening, "given the clear indications that this lawsuit was filed with malicious intentions and without legal merit, I order an investigation into possible abuse of the judicial system." Victoria barely registered the judge's last words. The only thing that mattered was that Madison was safe. When the session concluded, she turned to James, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "You did it," she whispered, overwhelmed with gratitude. James shook his head, taking her face in his hands. "We did it," he corrected, his eyes reflecting an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Together, they left the courthouse under the bright midday sun, a perfect contrast with the relief they felt. James guided her to his car, parked nearby. "We should go to the hospital immediately," he said, "to make sure Madison's treatment resumes without further delays." Victoria nodded, but before they could get into the vehicle, a familiar voice stopped them. "Crawford!" Both turned to find Richard Bennett advancing toward them, his face distorted by rage and humiliation. Though he was no longer part of the board of directors after his betrayal was discovered, he had evidently been watching the trial from the back of the room. "It's over, Bennett," James said with icy calm. "You've lost. Accept your defeat with some dignity." Bennett laughed, a harsh and unpleasant sound. "Dignity? You speak to me of dignity? The man who's ruining his reputation for an affair with an employee?" He spat the words, looking contemptuously at Victoria. "The entire board knows, Crawford. They all know you've become weak, sentimental. Victoria felt James tense at her side, but when he spoke, his voice remained perfectly controlled. "You're wrong about two fundamental things, Bennett," he responded, taking a step forward. "First, my relationship with Miss Hayes isn't an affair. It's the most real and valuable thing I've had in my life." Victoria felt a wave of warmth at his words, spoken so openly, without shame or reservations. "And second," James continued, his tone acquiring a dangerous edge, "you confuse love with weakness. Love hasn't made me weak, Bennett. It's made me stronger than you ever imagined." Bennett seemed momentarily disconcerted by the response, but quickly recovered his contemptuous expression. "Enjoy your moment, Crawford," he spat. "This isn't over." "Yes, it's over," James responded with finality. "For you, at least. The investigation the judge just ordered will likely lead you to face charges for judicial system abuse. And that's just the beginning." He took another step closer, his voice lowering to a tone only Bennett could hear. "If you come near Victoria, her sister, or anyone related to them again, I'll destroy you so completely you'll wish you'd never heard my name. Have I made myself clear?" Bennett visibly paled, taking a step back. Without another word, he turned and hurried away. Victoria watched the exchange with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. This man, whom she had once feared for his cold and calculating reputation, had just publicly declared his love for her, defended her without hesitation. "Did you mean it?" she asked when Bennett disappeared from view. "About me being the most valuable thing in your life?" James turned toward her, all the hardness he had shown Bennett completely gone, replaced by a tenderness he reserved only for her. "Every word," he responded, taking her hands in his. "For years, my life has been about acquiring power, control, success, objects I could possess, achievements I could enumerate. And then you came along, and you showed me something that can't be bought or controlled." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You showed me what it means to love unconditionally, Victoria, what it means to put someone else above yourself. And though it terrified me at first, now I can't imagine my life any other way. I can't imagine my life without you." Victoria felt her heart could burst with happiness. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle finally fit together, as if all the pain and struggle had been just the necessary path to reach this moment. "I love you too, James," she responded, her voice firm despite the emotions that overwhelmed her. "Not the CEO, not the ruthless businessman, though I admire your intelligence and determination. I love the man I saw in the suburbs, the one who cares for his mother with devotion, the one who risked everything to save my sister. The real man behind the mask." James smiled, a smile that illuminated his entire face, erasing the lines of worry and tension that usually marked it. "That man is yours," he said simply. "He always has been, from the moment you entered my office and begged me to fire you quickly." Victoria laughed, remembering that day that seemed to have happened in another life. "Not exactly the most romantic beginning," she commented. "On the contrary," James responded, his smile becoming mischievous. "It was the moment when for the first time in my career someone left me speechless, and that, my dear Victoria, is an achievement few can claim." He kissed her then, in the middle of the street, in front of the courthouse, not caring who might see them. A kiss that sealed promises, that spoke of a future together, that erased all the doubts and fears that had shadowed their path. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "Now let's go to the hospital," he said softly. "Your sister is waiting for us." Victoria nodded, a peace she hadn't felt in a long time spreading through her being. With Madison recovering, with James by her side, the future no longer seemed a frightening place, but a bright promise of possibilities. And as they headed to the hospital, hand in hand, Victoria reflected on how the words, "I'm begging you, just do it quickly," had been the catalyst for a journey neither of them had anticipated, but both now deeply appreciated. A desperate plea that had given way to a love that transformed two lives forever. Sunlight filtered through the wide penthouse windows, creating golden patterns on the table surface where Victoria reviewed the foundation's latest reports. 5 years had passed since that day in court. 5 years of changes, growth, and a happiness that sometimes still surprised her. "Working on Sunday again?" James's voice made her look up. He was leaning against the study doorframe, holding 2 coffee cups. At 40 years old, James Crawford remained as imposing as the day she met him, though some silver hair at his temples and expression lines around his eyes spoke of the passage of time. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. They were no longer cold or distant, but warm, alive, reflecting an inner peace that once seemed impossible. "Just reviewing the final numbers before the gala," Victoria responded, gratefully accepting the cup he offered. "I want to make sure everything is perfect." James sat on the edge of the desk, studying her with that gaze that even after so many years made her heart race. "It will be," he assured. "The Madison Hayes Foundation has grown more than anyone could have imagined. This year will exceed 50 million in fundraising." Victoria smiled at the mention of the foundation bearing her sister's name. It had been James's idea to create it 3 years ago, when it became clear the experimental treatment had worked and Madison was officially in remission. Now the foundation funded research in innovative treatments and provided access to experimental therapies for patients without resources. Madison herself, now a vibrant 24-year-old studying medicine, was the foundation's most eloquent spokesperson, sharing her story to inspire other patients and their families. "Sometimes I can't believe how much everything has changed," Victoria commented, standing to approach the window offering a panoramic view of Central Park. "It seems like yesterday I walked trembling into your office, begging you to fire me quickly." James approached, embracing her from behind, his chin gently resting on her head. "The day that changed our lives," he murmured, kissing her hair, though not in the way either of us expected. Victoria turned in his arms to look at him, her hands finding their way to his face, tracing the lines that had deepened with time but only made him more attractive in her eyes. "Do you regret anything?" she asked, a question she sometimes still asked, not from insecurity, but from constant amazement at the turn her life had taken. James shook his head, his eyes fixed on hers. "Not for a second," he responded with conviction, "though perhaps I should have done some things differently." "Like what?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. "Like not waiting so long to do this," he responded, releasing her briefly to reach into his pants pocket. When he pulled it out, he held a small blue velvet box. Victoria held her breath as he opened it, revealing an exquisite solitaire diamond ring on a platinum band. "Victoria Hayes," James began, his voice slightly trembling, so different from the ruthless CEO he once was. "For 5 years, you've transformed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've taught me that true strength lies in vulnerability, that control is an illusion, and that love, when it's real, is the only wealth that matters." He knelt before her, the powerful James Crawford, CEO of a corporate empire, kneeling like any man in love. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" he asked, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Of officially sharing the rest of our lives. Though in my heart you've been my family since the day you walked into my office." Tears sprang from Victoria's eyes. Despite being together for 5 years, despite living in the same apartment for 3, the proposal took her completely by surprise. "Yes," she responded, her voice broken with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." James slid the ring onto her finger, standing to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke of eternal promises. When they separated, Victoria noticed something unusual in his eyes, restrained tears. "James Crawford publicly showing emotion," she gently teased, wiping a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "The business world would be scandalized." He laughed, a free and genuine sound that was now much more frequent than in those early days. "Let them be scandalized," he responded, embracing her again. "I've discovered there are things much more important than the image we project to the world." The sound of the front door opening interrupted the moment, followed by Madison's cheerful voice. I'm home. Where's my favorite couple? Victoria and James shared a complicit glance before leaving the study to greet Madison. The young woman entered like a whirlwind of energy, her long, healthy hair tied in a ponytail, her cheeks pink from the November cold. "I found it!" Madison exclaimed, waving an envelope in her hand. "The results of my last exam, officially 5 years cancer-free." She stopped abruptly upon noticing the expressions on her sister's and James's faces and the sparkle on Victoria's left hand. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes widening. "Is that what I think it is?" Victoria extended her hand, showing the ring that now adorned her finger. "James just proposed to me," she confirmed, her face radiant with happiness. Madison let out a squeal of joy, throwing herself toward them in an embrace that almost knocked all three down. "Finally," she exclaimed, pulling back to look accusingly at James. "How long have you been carrying that ring in your pocket? 2 months? 3? James had the decency to look embarrassed. "Almost 4, he admitted. "I was waiting for the perfect moment. The man who can close multi-million-dollar negotiations without blinking, nervous about a marriage proposal," Madison joked, but her smile betrayed how much she had come to love this man who had entered their lives at the darkest moment and brought so much light. "Some things are more important than any business," James responded, looking at Victoria with an adoration he no longer tried to disguise. "And some questions deserve to be asked perfectly." The doorbell interrupted the moment. "That must be Mom," James said, referring to Catherine, whose condition had improved remarkably in recent years, thanks to new treatments, many of them funded by the foundation. "I invited her to lunch with us." While James went to receive his mother, Madison took Victoria's hands, her eyes shining with restrained emotions. "Are you happy, Vic?" she asked quietly. "Really happy?" Victoria looked toward the door where James had disappeared, then at her sister, healthy and vibrant, and finally at the ring symbolizing a promise of the future. "More than I ever thought possible," she responded with absolute sincerity. "Sometimes I wonder what our life would be like if I hadn't walked into his office that day, if I hadn't begged him to fire me quickly." Madison smiled, squeezing her sister's hands. "Fate has strange ways of working," she said. "Maybe some people are destined to find each other, regardless of circumstances." From the foyer came the voices of James and Catherine, along with another voice Victoria recognized as Dr. Anderson's, who had become a close friend of the family. "We should go greet them," Victoria suggested, but Madison held her for one more moment. "You know, I always felt guilty because you sacrificed so much for me," she said with sudden seriousness. "Your career, your dreams, your personal life. You put everything on pause because of my illness." Victoria started to protest, but Madison raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish," she requested. "What I want to say is that seeing you now, with James, with the foundation, with this life you've built together, makes me feel that in the end, everything had a purpose, that sometimes the hardest trials lead us to the most beautiful places." Victoria hugged her sister, words unnecessary between them. "Come on," she finally said, wiping a tear. "Our family is waiting for us." As they headed to the foyer, Victoria instinctively touched the small silver butterfly brooch she still wore after so many years. Transformation, James had said that first time. Death and rebirth. How appropriate that symbol turned out to be for the journey they had undertaken together. A desperate plea that transformed into the greatest blessing. A plea to end quickly that gave birth to a love story destined to last a lifetime. And as she joined James, who received her with an arm around her waist and a kiss on the temple, Victoria knew with certainty that sometimes endings are really just the beginning of something much more beautiful than we ever could have imagined. The end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with friends and family who need to hear this message of hope. To continue supporting stories like this and have access to exclusive content, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the Become a Member button below. Each donation helps us continue bringing you inspiring stories like this. Comment below which was your favorite part and what story you'd like to hear next.